Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Information Security Risk in ISOL 536 Security Architecture and Design. My name is Dr. Alan Dennis and I'm your instructor in this course. Moving on to Chapter 4's Table of Contents. These are the items that we'll go over in this conversation. This is about kind of an assessment of risk and a discussion of risk and talking about kind of what it is, why it can't totally go away, and how we can somewhat quantify it. Jumping right in, when we incorporate, when we talk about risk, we need to think about it in terms of probabilities and incomplete information because you rarely know everything. So one way that you can do this is think about the chance of something happening times what happens if it does happen, and that gives you some sense of the risk. So the understanding is, well, there's also another part of that equation, which is why should you take that chance even though something might happen? So the formula is partially correct. It gives you the risk, but there's also probably going to be a reward conversation that goes with this too. So the problem you have is that you don't necessarily know all of the probability of risk that can actually happen. There might be actuarial data out there that insurance companies do when they calculate risk, but you don't really have that in as a general rule inside of a given company. And when you talk about probability, well, how do you know that, right? Because it's going to depend. You might take industry standards of some sort, possibly, but even then, uh, so you don't really have this. So what do you do? A lot of times you'll you'll do a gut feel approach. What does it feel like to you? The problem with that is sometimes it's a fallible way of doing things. Sometimes they'll do back of napkin calculations fairly quickly. Uh, especially if the more systems you've seen, the better the heuristic of the individual becomes. And if they've rated lots of attack vectors, they're probably pretty comfortable pronouncing consistently what it is. And it's from experience. Um, it's also about a certain amount of intuition and what the organization is willing to take on. So what is their risk posture? Uh, so they need to know to make this assessment. So you as an architect, if you're coming in and doing a security assessment, you need to know very much about how it is structured. So what does the architecture look like? What does the infrastructure look like? And so that you can do a assessment essentially of a particular vulnerability or attack vector. And this is going to be true uh, with any kind of vulnerabilities and attack vectors um, that you've seen before. Now, if you haven't seen one before, um, it's a different problem. So the similar variation of the risk rating is a credible attack vector times impact, and it's coming up with what is a credible attack vector and the impact is some number of impact. It's going to have some sort of number. Um, and it's going to be somewhat dependent upon the situation and so on. So, personal risk uh, is another factor to think about. Uh, the analyst is not trying to make the system under analysis safe enough for him or herself. They're trying to do it good enough for the organization. So it's important know yourself, understanding the risk posture of the organization, not a personal sort of risk posture. I've seen this with security architects at times where they're very risk adverse, even if they might work at a company that is not. And that leads to some conflict between various elements in the organization where one part of the organization feels they should take on the risk, and yet the security architect is hesitant to do so. Also, because there is the potential of something, does that mean it is going to be bad, right? So something could happen. Uh, and so the the challenge here is to understand the uncertainty between um, kind of the noise and the thing that might actually happen, and so on. Um, you don't necessarily know what the objective of an attacker is, so there's lots of uncertainty here. That's a key thing to keep in mind. And you certainly don't know the probability of a given event, although you're probably going to guess. So continuing the conversation around just because it might be bad, is it? Um, we are interested in trying to prevent credible attack vectors from success. We don't necessarily care what the goal of the attacker might be. We just want to protect a particular attack vector that could happen, that is likely or has the potential of happening. We constrain our definition of risk to humans that are threat agents. So we're not going to try to protect for this conversation against natural occurrences or hardware failures or fires or whatever it might be. We're also going to restrict it to the conversation to attacks aimed at computer systems and attack methods meant to abuse or misuse a system. So those are the kind of the constraints that we're narrowing in on. When you think about what makes up risk, it's a set of conditions that must be true in order for any significant, and it's going to exist in any computer system. And the the key thing is that um, it can never really truly be pushed away. You'll always have a certain amount of risk, but uh, you can restrict it and manage it to a certain amount. And you can certainly work on negating the ability of the attack to succeed. So it may be that you can't prevent the attack, but you can certainly keep the attack from being successful. And it's about trying to kill the chain so that it's unable to succeed. So what's a threat? Um, you'll see it scattered around in lots of situations. Uh, some methodologies talk about a threat is used to mean some type of attack methodology, such as spoofing or brute force, password cracking. Some circumstances it makes sense to uh, components of a threat attack. It assumes a couple things. Attack methodologies can be considered equal, and there are sufficient resources to guard against every attack methodology. To understand how relevant any particular threat agent is to a certain attack surface, you've got to consider the impact or loss to the organization and the level of protection required to dissuade that particular type of attack. So the basic idea here is that if what they're going after uh, is valuable, then you're willing to spend more energy to protect it. If it's something that is not terribly valuable, the company is oftentimes going to be not all that willing to invest a lot of money protecting it. So when we talk about exposure, there's one way that that can definitely come about. If you have organizations that don't have separations of duties, so that you have administrative staff that is doing things with the backend servers, databases, applications, and their system administrators, and so on, they can do a lot of really bad things accidentally or on purpose. So if you have a more mature organization, the administrative staff, they still have a lot of power and they can still do a lot of damage, but there's some protections in place to attempt to kind of mitigate it or manage it. For example, you have strict separation of duties. So a database administrator wouldn't be touching an application server. You have independent monitoring of when these administrative activities are occurring so that you can look and see if somebody is doing something they should not. So if I happen to have, for some reason, administrative access at an enterprise level, so I've got really high permissions in the domain, and I'm logging onto a machine that I shouldn't be, it should be caught through some sort of monitoring process and flagged and investigated. Ideally, it should be restricted, but there may be situations where that may not be feasible. You also have the restrictions of uh, the outbound capabilities at the time and when and on the network where administrative duties are being carried out. So you may lock down the computers during that period so that they're not able to get out, so that you're restricted to the machine itself. You definitely want to restrict inbound vectors to administrative staff so that they're only using it whenever they're doing out work-related activities that are necessary for that particular situation. So there's this concept of phishing, and I'm sure as security people are familiar with the concept of phishing. Spear phishing is a subset of that type of phishing that is very targeted. So if the more somebody knows about you or somebody within the organization, the more they're able to tailor their phishing attack to you. So they may identify somebody that is somebody that has administrative access within an organization and attempt to compromise them in some fashion to get their credentials or whatever it might be. So they're very targeted. These are still relatively rare, but they do occur. And there's something to be aware of. Just because somebody knows your name, maybe even knows who you work for, uh, and so on, doesn't necessarily mean that you should tell them something that you wouldn't normally tell someone else. So be cautious of that. Email and phishing attacks, email spam and phishing attacks are very common. Spear phishing less so, but it can be very devastating because it may be difficult to resist the urge to bite. Um, Exposure is whenever an attacker is able to actually make contact with the vulnerability, so they actually get access to the vulnerability. Um, they must make use of whatever media the vulnerability expresses itself through. So there's generally some way that you can see the vulnerability as well. Uh, the basic the classic types of vulnerabilities are going to be things like the user interface, command line interface, network protocols, files that are especially configuration files, interprocess communication, and system drivers. Those are the typical classic sort of examples. So treatment to protect against a vulnerability, they tend to apply to many variations of that vulnerability. So security architects, um, you need to know kind of the classes of vulnerabilities that are going on. You need to understand the variation of the classes, um, and you need to understand kind of what is required to address them and how you can protect them. A classic example is the kind of the heap overflow or buffer overflow. Uh, and the idea here was that in earlier operating systems, and it still could occur in certain web browsers in certain situations, that you would go beyond the essentially the bounds of an array and start getting out of the heap into some other parts of memory. Um, and start doing things that you shouldn't be able to do as a vulnerability. Most modern programming languages have addressed that by not allowing something to go beyond the stated bounds of an array. It was more of a vulnerability inside of C++, for example. Um, but you do need to understand how heap overflow works and why it works. But more importantly than being able to write the code to go against it, you would probably be looking for, are they using a library that protects against it as well? When we talk about impact, we're talking about what happens whenever something happens, something negative occurs. So the biggest kind of concern you have is whenever somebody gets into your network and takes over, say, a server and starts using it to attack your other systems. So a single compromised server could be really bad if you don't have a fair amount of restrictions in place to stop servers from getting to each other. So, for example, if you had all of your servers running underneath the same system domain account, uh, where they all had access to each other, it would be really bad if one of them were to become compromised. We talk about business impact, we're typically talking about things like uh, revenue, loss of money. Um, you may be talking about exposure of information that you don't want getting out, such as customer information, and so on. Things with high impact, high business impact, are going to be treated much more severely than those with low. As organizations become more mature in security, uh, it's a good idea to have basically data sensitivity scales or classifications of data and documents and so on. So it's basically a way of being able to say, for example, this data set includes personally identifiable information. and as such, it receives this level of classification. Those things with a higher level of sensitivity and higher ratings, essentially, are going to be treated more carefully than those with lower. And also, you typically will rate them on the impact that it will have to the business. So if you're a sales organization of some sort and you've got a list of your customers, that's probably pretty important because it could be something that a competitor might want to get their hands on. So when we talk about who cares about risk, you need to understand that there are different stakeholders and different audiences. The stakeholder is simply somebody that has an interest in something, be it a project, a discussion, data, whatever it might be. Um, but each one of them will have slightly different kind of perspectives on it and different views and different concerns. So you may want to adjust your message according to who it is that you're talking to. So which one of the stakeholders in the organization and so on. And you don't want to just say, well, okay, this is a really risky sort of thing. You'd want to be able to speak in very specific terms. What might happen if that information were to be exposed, and what business impact is going to be the result of something happening that was negative? And it's got to be around this whole concept of it's a successful exercise of a credible attack vector, and how that impacts the organization's operations and goals. Somebody's going to own the risk if the risk is taken on. So it's likely going to be the person that has the business kind of decision to make that risk, take on that risk. And there's several different people that could be. Whenever we're talking about deciding about the risk, is proceed with treatment means that yes, you can go forward, but you need to have some way of protecting it. You need an exception, fix the risk later on. That's always risky because later on may not happen. Um, and the highest is you need to take care of it, fix it now. That happens whenever something really significant occurs. It's both a credible risk. It's got a moderately high probability of being found and used. And if it were to be used, the consequences are typically severe. So security posture is basically referring to how much risk an organization is willing to take on. There's not one size fits all here. So uh, an organizational security policy might be a starting point for figuring out what their security posture is. But it's also going to be a question of it needs to be a relatively mature discussion. It's going to take some time to get there. And it's all about education and making sure that the individuals involved that are making decision know or make an informed decision about what the risks might be and what the consequences could be if they were to occur. So in summary, we've talked a bit about risk. We've talked about security assessments and how you do threat modeling. We talked through one sort of methodology that goes through of understanding and rating the risk using terms like vectors and so on. So basically, the goal here is to have something that is repeatable and that is not influenced by the person doing it. So the organization, if you have two people doing security reviews, you should have the same result regardless of who does it. You definitely want to build threat models and you want to talk about requirements for system security earlier than later in the process. And with that, thank you for listening. This concludes the conversation around Chapter 4. Stay safe. I'll talk with you next week when we talk about Chapter 5.